So then I'm going to switch to the requirements for carbon certification. So what is carbon certification? How does it work? So the very principle of carbon certification is based on a counterfactual. So the idea is that you make an estimation of the emissions or the removals of your project. So this is the project scenario. For example, so if I take an agricultural example, so you might take the decision to change the fertilization on your farm. So you switch from mineral to organic fertilizer, and you start applying fertilization in a more precise way so that on the whole, you can actually reduce the volumes that you apply. And then you make an estimate of what would have happened without the project. What would have happened on a business as usual basis. And this is what we call the baseline scenario, the reference scenario. So in that case, most probably you could imagine that the fertilization application wouldn't have changed. So you would have went on pursued with mineral fertilizers using the same volumes. And so the volume of credits that you're going to generate with carbon certification, it's really the difference between your baseline scenario, so your business as usual trend, and what is happening with your project. With the notion that so 1 ton of CO2 equivalent equals 1 carbon credit. The idea with this kind of evaluation is to have a payment that is based on results, on the performance. So you're not like, I mean, it's not enough to just have the means to do it. You have to actually prove what you did. And definitely this is a tool that incentivizes progress trajectories. It can't really be used to value an existing stock of carbon. If you already have like good practices and everything, you would have to improve them. So you can't value the stock. And this is a question that is really asked in the livestock sector, because you can't really value a stock that is already existing in grasslands. So you actually have to prove that you're doing better than before, or at least better than what would have happened without the project. So usually you can't use it to value existing stocks. But if you can prove that there was a threat over this stock, then if you're able to demonstrate that then you might actually value the fact that you maintain the stock. And this is actually what's happening in the with avoided deforestation, although it's really hard to prove, because the thing is that you'll never know what would have happened without the project. So yeah, this is about how you frame it. Then, yeah, 2 different notions. So you have 2 complementary approaches in the carbon methodologies. So you will use some measurement of greenhouse gases, and then you have the whole project engineering about how do you certify the emission reductions. So the first part on the left is about how do you calculate greenhouse gas emissions or removals from an activity at a given moment. So what kind of equation are you going to use? How are you going to do the modeling of this performance? Yeah, I'm calling it taking the temperature. And this kind of auditing is different from the rules that allow you to go from an estimate, so the temperature you took from the estimate of the emissions at a given moment, to the estimate of emission reductions by project over a certain time. And this whole engineering part includes so the rules on how you make the reference scenario, how do you demonstrate additionality, how do you manage uncertainty, and so on. I will go back to that. Yeah, and just so for one of the tools that you are familiar with, CAP2ER, CAP2ER, yeah. CAP2ER is actually nearly on both sides. So it's mostly a carbon auditing tool, but since it does also integrate a module to actually generate carbon action plans, but it does not include like the whole procedures and requirements for carbon certification. Then, so carbon certification schemes, they all go with a set of quality criteria that has been the same for over the last 20 years to ensure the environmental integrity of the project. This is what we call so monitoring, reporting, and verification, MRV. And so this set of criteria was really introduced right from the beginning with the Kyoto Protocol. And today you also have major voluntary organizations that diffuse this criteria. So the projects, the emission reduction have to be measurable and monitored. The calculation has to be transparent, verified by an independent third party. The emission reductions, the removal have to be unique. You should be able to trace them. Whenever there is a risk of non-permanence, it should be managed. Then additionality, you should be able to demonstrate that your project kind of needed the carbon incentive to actually happen. And last but not least, co-benefits. The project shouldn't have any detrimental impact on social or environmental aspects. So I'm going to just look closer at all those criteria. So about the first criteria, measuring and monitoring. So what does it mean? It means that to have carbon certification, you need quantification methods that are transparent, comprehensive, and robust. You should be relying on the latest science expertise. And this is not always easy because it means that you always have to revise your methodology with the science that is coming. Then another issue with these quantification methods is that you need to make sure that you have available and qualitative data, and that these data are also available for the project holders on the ground. And on the whole question with that is how do you make the trade-off between costs and accuracy? And this is the very question about carbon certification, is what kind of balance do you find between having something that is credible enough without being too costly? And I'm just giving some examples for each criteria from the label bas carbone, because this is the one I know the most. So one of the good practice about the quantification methodology was about the crop field methodology, so which is about soil carbon and that kind of measures. It was really built with the contribution of researchers from the Public Institute, Research Institute in Hague. So yeah, it really ensured that you had like the latest science, and you had so the scientific ground that wanted the most of credibility, and the possible project holders, methodology developer that had this dimension of, okay, but what can we really do this on the ground? Then on transparency and verification. So the idea is that the whole documentation of the project, of the methods, and the certification should be made public. And the project should be verified by an independent organization with regular audits. What are the problems with that? Once we've set this criteria, you always have some information asymmetry. So you will always have like some information that are on the side of the project holders that the auditors won't have. So how to frame the carbon certification in a way to actually mitigate this risk. About the auditors, once we've said, okay, we need independent auditors, but who is supposed to be accredited for that kind of audits? Who authorizes the audits? And then on the ground, even though you said, okay, we need audit rules and so on, it's not always that easy to specify what kind of rules you need if you need a systematic field audit, or can you do some documentation on it? Sometimes it's not necessary to go on the field, and what kind of rules should be applied for sampling. And the example I give here from the label de carbone is that, so there was, in the forest methodologies, so we're already at the third revision of the forest methodologies, and each time they did include some more precise information on the sampling methods for the field audit, because that wasn't clear enough. So it's really like a learning by doing process all the time. Then on the uniqueness of and traceability, what does it mean? It means that each credit, each certificate should be linked to a registry and only be registered once. The idea is to avoid double issuance. So one project shouldn't be able to emit twice the same emission reduction. And on the contrary, so if it's emitted once, it shouldn't be used by various organizations. So it's usually through registries that is being done. With the label de carbone, so we do have a registry that is held by the Ministry of Environment. They list the projects, the fundings, and what are the emitted credits, which one were already used, we say retired. And there is one measure that is really specific to the label de carbone, which is the fact that the certificates can't be transferred, which guarantees that there is no, I mean, it limits at least the risks that there would be double uses. Okay, I'm not going to talk more about the double claiming thing. Then on permanence, so carbon certification should establish the project duration. How do you renew the projects? What kind of periodic control do you have over the project lifetime? And how do you manage the non-permanence risk, especially when we're talking about the land sector? Carbon can be released. So what kind of questions do we ask ourselves when we're talking about this permanence? So what should be the project duration? You have some standards that will talk about 100 years and so on, but just how do you actually verify that? How to make it credible? And how frequent can you actually make an audit? Can you actually really like have an audit for 100 years, every 5 years, and so on? And another point about permanence, especially in the land sector, is how do you include the impact of climate change? So like your calculations are made for what is climate change at a certain moment, but it's going to change. So how do you already plan to make the move progressively, depending on what's happening in terms of climate change? And more generally, the idea about, I mean, the way standards deal with non-permanence is to use discounts. So like, you have a risk of drought, fire, whatever, so on. So you're gonna just put aside a certain percentage of your carbon credits, not using them. They go like in a buffer pool. That is kind of an insurance, mutual insurance for various projects. Yeah, and just an example from the label de carbone. So there is a systematic 10% discount on certificates for forest methodologies that is supposedly taking into account the risks from climate and the sanitary risks. And then if you're in a region that has like fire risks on top of that, then you have, again, an additional discount that can be up to 15%, so 10% plus 15%, for example. Additionality. This is really the trickiest criteria for carbon certification. So the idea that you have to demonstrate that your activity wouldn't have happened without the project. But you'll never know what would have happened without the project. So we have a few indicators that we use to see that. So first, you usually have to demonstrate that the project activity is not what is already required by law. This is what we call the demonstration of regulatory additionality. And you have financial additionality. The project shouldn't be the most profitable option. And sometimes, depending on the demonstration, you might have to show that the sale of the carbon credits represent a certain amount of the revenues for the project. It doesn't mean that you can't have any public subsidies. They can contribute to the funding, but usually you'll put like a threshold on that. For a lot of projects in the label bas carbone, it's 50%. So you can have public subsidies or other fundings up to 50%, but then it can't be on top of that. Otherwise, it is considered that you wouldn't need a carbon certification project to do that. So the idea about that, even though it's really not the easiest thing to demonstrate, is to limit the windfall effect. Is to actually show that your funding is efficient for the effect you're looking for. But well, it does raises a lot of questions, and like this 50% threshold that has been put in France, and what kind of threshold should we put? And sometimes it's not about the money, and for most of the livestock projects, it's not really about the financial revenues that would be needed to start the project. There can also be some other kinds of barriers, technical ones, social, organizational, like you've always done like that, and it's just it does require a new organization to do it in another way. So yeah, there are all kinds of demonstration for additionality, but this is really a key criteria for carbon certification. Just all this list of criteria may seem like, oh, that's a lot too complicated. There are numerous criteria, it's quite complex and so on. But at the same time, obviously, you need to keep the offer attractive for farmers, for foresters, and for the financiers also. So there are a few ways to actually reduce the cost of the MRV. And some of the ways to do that is, to some extent, a standardization of the estimates, so the calculation, for example, by using regional data in the reference scenario. You may have some group certification so that you can aggregate some projects and do not need like all the sampling. I mean, the MRV cost would be lower. And then, yeah, on the whole, one of the things that may reduce the MRV cost is you always need to use like a conservativeness principle. So whenever you don't know, whenever you have to manage uncertainty and so on, you have to be conservative. And the way we usually deal with it is applying discount rates over the whole number of credits that is generated. So yeah, this arbitration between costs and accuracy is really key in the carbon certification process. And depending on the context, the answer might not always be the same. Do you have any questions on those criteria?
Yes, we have a question from Saverio.
Yeah, I can't really see them, so if you...
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. In Italy, we have a market scheme of carbon credit, now only for the forest sector. And we have some trouble. One trouble is the sellers would you like sell the credit ex ante before of the credit is certificated. but the certification organism not certificate the credit before of the monitoring period that is usually 5 years. The question is in the market scheme in France, it's possible to sell the credits ex ante before of the certification of credits. And
Yeah,
another question. Sorry,
Go ahead.
For the permanence. In Italy, we use the buffer. There is some part of carbon credit that was generated from the project that is not possible sell for the risks of fire or another extreme events. And yeah, I not see this buffer in your slide on the permanence.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So very good question. So about the ex-ante thing, there is really a common good practice on carbon certification that is usually considering we should not be emitting ex-ante credits. We should emit credits that were already removed. I mean, carbon that is already removed and so on. In the level by carbon, we do use ex-ante credits, which means that we have an audit of control that actually delivers the credits at 5 years, after 5 years. And we're going to deliver the credits, well, for the past 5 years and for the 35 years to come. So on the whole, we do the calculation on a 40 years period, which means that part of it, most of it, is actually ex-ante credits. And it goes with communication support to say that, okay, you should be saying it when you're buying ex-ante credit and not like claiming that you're. So it's not perfect, but this is the way it's done. You do have also other options, like for example, the Woodland Carbon Code, so which is a national certification frameworks for afforestation in the UK. What they do is that they deliver pending units, and then they issue the real unit. So with the curve of the growing trees, you'll have all new real credits that will materialize. So this is like pending units that will be transformed into real units once you had really the carbon that is being removed. I guess this is the best option actually to do. So
yes,
to have like a previous stages. And this is how most of the credits actually do it. You also find this kind of pre-credits with technological CCS, carbon storage technologies. So, because obviously these are major technologies that do require a lot of money to finance the projects before and so on, and it's not stored, it's not removed right from the beginning. So in those cases, they also deliver like pre-credits. But this is complicated because for forestry especially, obviously you will need the money at the beginning of the project.
yes,
But then the carbon will be removed later. So I guess that the best is anyway an option that allows for the most transparency possible, so not to lie on what you're selling. So if you're actually selling something that will supposedly be removed in 20 years, you should say it. Yeah, but so the label by carbon is kind of an exception by accepting ex-ante credit on those things. But this is not considered a good practice on international standard. I will show that with the integrity guidelines that actually refuse mostly ex-ante thing. And then for the buffers, so yeah, we do not have a real buffer. We use discounting options. So a buffer, I mean, an actual buffer would work in a way that so you put aside the credits, and then every time you have a fire, you have a drought, you have like any kind of extreme event or accident, you put out the number of credits that is needed depending on the accident too. In the level carbon is just like, okay, we do estimate we might have 25% on the whole that is like lost, but we do not really account like putting out the credits out of the buffer. So yeah, you might have various ways for the buffer to work. Something that is important to know with the buffers now is that that was shown in the United States with forestry projects. It was shown that the buffers, especially in California, might not be enough. So the percentage of credits that you do put aside was not enough compared to the trend of increasing fires that you have in the region. So there is a question about the size of the buffers and how do you increase it with time when climate change is changing also. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
Donald?
you. Yes.
Yep, thanks. A question there on the slide on the measurement and monitoring of emissions and removals. You mentioned the quantification of emission reductions and avoided emissions. What is the difference between the two of those, and are they valued the same?
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, like the main example is probably about the avoided deforestation. So like when you protect a forest that is under a threat of deforestation, you're actually avoiding emissions. You're not like reducing emissions, you're maintaining a stock. And when you're actually like reducing your fertilizers, you're concretely reducing the emissions each year and so on. Are they valued the same? We call it a carbon unit, a carbon credit in the same way. And so far, we can say, yeah, that it was not really differentiated. But today, with the number of scandals that there were about the RED project, so if we avoided deforestation project, probably they're not valued anymore in the same way. So they actually kind of are usually, I mean, RED projects are mostly not considered as good quality projects. So we can say that this is, although they're called the same, although they consider the same units, they're not exactly valued anymore in the same way. But yeah, it's not always, I mean, you will see when I will show you the trends and volumes and so on, you don't have like, okay, this is this much of avoided, this much, and even the removals, this is just the start, the beginning of just distinguishing between removals and emission reductions. Previously, it was not done.
All right, thanks.
There any other question on this criteria?
Yes, one question from Lucia.
Hi everyone. I have a question in the framework of the project regarding what we could call like the best available techniques. I mean, probably it's a very specific case of Spain, but they have just been published this year, so we have this transition period until they are going to be like officially required. So if I understood, Clotilde, you mentioned that could we say that these best available techniques don't how do you say, they are not good for the additionality, so they are like they will be like mandatory, so they would not account for credit market, or because especially because of the transition period, I guess, but just if you maybe can clarify.
Yeah. So I'm not sure of what is exactly called in Spain best available techniques, but if the idea is that carbon certification is to scale up some practices, to make them more widespread. So if I take it with the word best available techniques, I would say that it's not the majority that is actually using the best techniques. So I would say that if it's like the 10 best % of livestock farmers that are using this best available techniques, then still additional, because I mean, you still have 90% to go. If it means that this best available techniques do become requirements, I guess that's a question of time. So you could say that it's additional for sure in the meantime when it's still not legally required. But then it's usually about how widespread is the technique. So, for example, in France, there is an obligation, a legal obligation for reforestation. But what happens is that it's not done. So projects might still be considered additional because you can show that in practice, no one is doing it. So you still need like additional support to do the thing.
Okay.
So
Okay,
yeah,
thanks.
the way we use it is about how much is the technique used, and you could say that whenever you don't have like the vast majority that has adopted a technique in a region and a country and so on, it's still additional. There is still some room to scale up the practice.
Okay, thank you very much.
But this is definitely the hardest criteria to define.